Could you put my glasses on me first? I noticed that your brother was already settled, having you there. He was a little settled before you got there, but maybe that was knowing you were coming. So
I just gave him some tools. He's still gonna do all the work.
mhm.
He can hear us.
I think Katie can hear us. No one else is online.
Ham doesn't have quite the same intoxicating smell as chicken or beef. Like, what is that?
Pork.
Ham? And I was like, oh, that's pork.
And my special glasses. Pork.
Your dad's sorry glasses.
Mm-hmm.
I'm severely dehydrated.
Mm-hmm.
The water was on this table.
You put it out there.
Hey, I know you're about to start.
Mm-hmm.
Can I scrub potatoes or patty hamburger patties
Sure.
while we're doing this?
Mm-hmm.
You want quarter pound patty?
I do.
How am I packaging them?
Probably just have them layered with the foil.
You got it. So
Thanks.
that loud, so I'm gonna keep these open.
Okay. So it's just you and me. You're muted.
I'm so tired.
Did I unmute?
Yeah, you did.
You said just you and me, peanut butter and jelly. That's what I had in my lunch with my preschool kids today, because that's all I could find this morning when I was making my lunch.
I've been doing these things for, well, I did one for Jana, and I've been wanting to do them for a long time, where you don't need it anymore, and I don't really need it anymore, but where you like have a week's menu plan kind of thing, and you know exactly, because they have stuff like that online, but it's not, for me, it's never very useful, just because either my family doesn't like it, or
Right.
it's just too much or whatever. But I don't know. I've been doing those now, so we don't have the time where it's only peanut butter and jelly in the cupboard.
That's nice.
And hey, and Alexa is kicking butt on just helping me kind of get life settled. It's so nice.
Awesome.
Yeah. So
You have your office all set up already?
yeah, my office is set up, and
Cool.
my pantry's been gutted, and she's just kind of taking things to Goodwill. And right now my dining room is torn apart because she's redoing all the chairs. And
Nice.
yeah, well, this could just be you and me. We could just catch up.
Hey. Awesome. I got to FaceTime Noah today and talk to Abby before I came to this. So I'm a happy mom.
I bet.
I hadn't talked to Noah for a while, and I called him on the way to work, which is he's got an 8:00 class, and I get there like a little before 8, even though I don't have kids till 9.
Mhm.
And so I got to talk to him, and he's got long hair. I'm like, I mean, he hates it, but I'm like, just go trust somebody to cut your hair. Don't wait 3 more weeks. It's out of control.
Does he have any give at all to his hair, or is it pretty straight?
There's a little wave, but he's trying to just put gel in it, but it's so long and thick that it just kind of goes, it just, yeah, he doesn't want it long. He just is afraid someone there is going to mess it up. So I'm like, it's okay. It'll grow.
Yeah.
But
But
Abby's like, Mom, it looks pretty bad.
if he waits for 3 weeks, then he'll, if the haircut's terrible, it'll grow out by the time he goes back.
That's right.
I'm happy for all of you parents who get to have your kids home for, what is it? Is it 6 weeks?
Something like that. Yeah, they'll have 2 weeks of school and 1 week of finals before the semester's over from home.
Yeah, that's nice.
So, yeah.
Let me make sure.
Anyone else ding donging yet? Two more people?
Yep.
Good.
Let me make sure Priscilla's on. Jana has been volunteering for something called CASA, which I think probably everybody who's on right now knows what that is. The mentoring program for children. It's nationwide. Anyway, she's still doing training, and her training is Thursday nights at 6 o'clock. So she's has to listen to this later, but she's just learning a lot. I mean, it's a good thing for her to do, be a mentor, because she kind of naturally does that. And then the only problem is going to be the court stuff. You know, she's not going to, and the heartbreak, I would say. But it'd be good for her to do it while she's there. So.
Is it a little bit like Big Brothers Big Sisters used to be?
No, I would say it's a little bit more official than that. From what I know about Big Brothers Big Sisters, it was a good program, and the people ahead of it knew what they were doing, but everyone else was just like a good time volunteer kind of thing. But Janet's actually receiving a lot of training, so it's actually, I think it's a little bit more official, if that's a valid criticism of them. I mean, she's actually going to be a mentor for the kids with the court system, so it's kind of,
Oh, okay.
it's pretty serious. Good for her, though. Thank you, everybody else who's here. I just I'm giving it time for everybody to get on. I guess 6 o'clock on Thursday isn't the best time, but initially for my youngest participants, it was the best time for them. So let me see.
So the official answer on how CASA and Big Brothers Big Sisters are different is CASA is the court. They go in with and actually deal with the courts. Where Big Brothers Big Sisters is just like anybody who says they need a big brother or mentor. But the CASA is like kids that have been abused that need someone to advocate for them in court.
Okay.
Makes sense. So that's why she's having to get trained. But it's been good, and Alexa has been a good support for her because she learned a lot about that whole system. All right, well, I might as well get moving. I have been shopping all day, getting ready for a retreat. So, and then right before this, I have one of my piano students who changed his lesson to 5 o'clock. So I was pretty much driving, and at every stop light, I was sending a text to remind people. Yep, that's just the way it was today, but it's still a good day. Okay, so in our Old Testament overview, and many of you who are on already know a lot of this information, but our timeline looks like this. We started with the creation, and then we went from the creation to the fall of man, which is, just a way of saying the first sin, really. And then after that is Cain and Abel. And a lot of these stories I am bringing up to you guys because there are evidences of these stories in our culture. So it's an important part of your education to know these stories and to know things like my brother's keeper. Where in the world did that phrase come from? It's in movies, it's in music, it's in just regular language. It was actually, I think this was in Pennsylvania. Was that in Pennsylvania, Katie, at Carlisle Church of Christ, where they had a brother's keepers system or something? Do you remember that?
A little bit, I think maybe.
And it was just simply like what people might call a life group, or a lot of times it was grouped by neighborhoods or cities, and it was for instance, if Nancy and I were in the same neighborhood, I would be kind of appointed to help make sure she had what she needed, and that we were, she was getting to worship if she needed to. And personally, I just think it's an extra system that's adding to the Word of God. None of that stuff is wrong, but you don't need to slap a title on it and make it a thing. So anyway, but that kind of thing comes from Cain talking to God, am I my brother's keeper? So then moving on from that, we ended up at the flood, and that the whole world was evil and the whole world was wiped out except for Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their wives. And then that's where we are now. And we're pretty much in Genesis chapter 10. We're not going to spend a lot of time there. I will tell you that we're talking about genealogies and descendants. Now, that's an important thing to talk about because Noah represented the rebirth of the world, right? He was like Adam. Everybody came from Adam. Well, now everybody came from Noah. So it was like the rebirth of mankind. My title actually says Descendants of Noah, and it just really talks through all the descendants of Noah. So we're not going to spend time there. Not that it's not important. It definitely is if it's in the Bible. The Israelites or the Hebrews were obsessed with genealogies, and for good reason. For one thing, for years and years and years, as we see later in the Old Testament, the Christ is prophesied and his genealogy is mentioned, what line he was going to come from. So it was very important to them. It was also important because of the bloodline and who their mother and father was very important. You'll probably hear lessons on that kind of thing, but we're not, we're doing an overview. We're up at the level of airplanes, so we're just looking down. So moving on to Genesis chapter 11. This is a cool story, and most people have heard something about this story. And remember, we talked really early on about the ancient Near East, which is the Mesopotamia area. They call a little bit to the west, they call it the Fertile Crescent, and it included that whole area, and I'd shown you maps. Well, every known culture from the ancient Near East has a story similar to the Tower of Babel, or Babel, whichever way you want to pronounce that. And, whereas as a believer of the Word of God, you don't have to have those outside evidences. It's just one of those cool things that is actually backed up with evidence. And I'm going to start in Genesis 11, and I'm not really sure. Let's see. Well, Kim Drawbaugh, how do you feel about reading for me today?
That'll be great.
Thank you. So if you'll read Genesis 11, 1 through 9.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men had built. And the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do, and nothing that they purpose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down, and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth.
Thank you. So we have just 9 verses addressing the Tower of Babel, the confusion of language, and yet this is also a very common story in our culture. I feel like there was a movie called that, or maybe a TV show. I hadn't, it's not something I saw, but I think I saw an advertisement for it, which anytime there's like a biblical term that's, you know, a TV advertisement, I'm interested. So it may have nothing to do with the actual Tower of Babel, but I think it was called Babel. But here we have the descendants from the ark that are coming together, and they're building a great city, and they're building a great tower. It says that they used brick for stone and they used tar for mortar. Kim's had said bitumen. And what we know from this is it was the same thing that Noah was instructed in Genesis 6. I think it's verse 14 where he is told to put pitch on the ark. And pitch on the ark made it waterproof. And therefore, this tower that they're erecting is going to be strong and it's going to be waterproof. You know, they've put these bricks together, and I guess they pat them together and they cook them so that they're hard. And they could be destroyed by water, but these have been reinforced with this tar, my version says. Bitumen is what Kim's had said, and some versions say asphalt. It's all around the same thing, even though asphalt doesn't, in our day and age, asphalt is like sandy rocks. But okay, let's see. And I think what's really interesting about this is we begin to see this phenomenon of learning, right? So you had Noah, he was instructed on how to build the ark. And then they take that piece of information that they learned from Noah or from his descendants, and they're building on it. I mean, literally, they're building on it, but they're building on that knowledge. And the reason that's significant is because he says some pretty cool stuff about man here. He says, behold, in verse 6, they are one people and they all have the same language, and this is what they began to do. And now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. So obviously the Creator knows our capacity for learning, our man's capacity for learning and building and growing and building on that information. And it wasn't the time for it. We're not really told that this was the sin of pride. We're not really told exactly the whole reason for the confusion, except that nothing will be impossible for them. But this, for some reason, this wasn't the time for it. Because buildings like this have been built since. And it's clear that it wasn't God prohibiting building, it was God prohibiting it at the time, right? Or you wouldn't have the Twin Towers or the Sears building or any of the tall buildings, because there's no way what they were doing was anywhere near that scale. But God had determined it wasn't the time. Hey, Suzanne, we're in Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel. But this phenomenon of learning is very significant because think about what we have now. Think about how incredible science is. And, you know, I homeschooled my kids and I didn't do a horrible job of it, but I will tell you, I couldn't get through physics and I really tried. And Joseph and I sat and we read through it and we were working through it. And I was like, man, I've read this sentence 4 times describing what I should know, and I can't even tell you what that means. You know, there's just some things that I couldn't get through my brain. But there's so much information out there that we now have. I do think it's very significant, and most of you who are on right now, oh, give me 1 minute. Looks like Nancy's had some trouble. Anybody else having trouble, or is that just Nancy? Because she wanted to know. Everybody else is okay? Okay, let me tell her quickly. Maybe she'll call. But there's a time much later when we have kings that God drops information, just miraculously drops it on King Solomon, right? He was very blessed with knowledge and information and discernment. And I think that in the span of time as man was learning things, that was a big, big jump in information, because it specifically says he learned about animals and he learned about I want to say trees, but I might say vegetation. But the point is, there were a lot of things that Solomon just got a great big jump in his knowledge about. But since then, we learn more and more all the time. So, you know, I think making judgment on why exactly God confused their language and spread them all over it's just unclear in this. There's another thing that they learned from God, likely, and that is the sewing of clothes. Because remember when Adam and Eve realized they were naked and they sort of put fig leaves on them, God actually killed an animal and sewed the skin together and made them clothing. So don't you know, from that point on, then they had this model that they could imitate, and then they could expand from there. As we know, it expanded into weaving and spinning yarn and shearing animals and sewing together clothing. So it's just significant, I believe, what God says about man. He says, then nothing is going to be impossible. They're going to figure this out. This is the place that they're going. He created us that way. And yet you don't get from this really that he's upset that they were learning and doing. It just appears it wasn't the right time. Has anybody else heard anything about Genesis 11?
Wasn't their motive like to reach I mean, maybe their motive. Does it talk about like why they were doing it? I thought it did, but I'm not.
So verse 4 says, come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven, and let us make for ourselves a name, otherwise we will be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. So that is their reasoning together. Whether they were trying to reach heaven or look into the heavens, like observe the heavens, but certainly be up high so they can see everywhere. It's like when Alexa came back from Six Flags. Apparently, she went as an adult and went on all the roller coasters she wanted to, as opposed to going with her parents who didn't want to go on any roller coasters. Anyway, so she was like, the coolest part of it was being so high up and being able just to see so far. You know, so some have supposed, Tori, and that's what this is, it's supposition, but some have supposed that they wanted to get high up so they could see far away. They don't say that their motivation is so we can see our enemies coming and, you know, be like a watchtower, but they do say they want to make a name for themselves, and they don't want to be scattered over the face of the whole earth, which is precisely what does end up happening to them, right? Ironic. Because in verse 8 it said, so the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth. You know, it's just 4 verses later and it's exactly what they did not want. And they stopped building the city. So it's chaos, and it stopped all building of the city. And then it says, therefore its name was called Babel, and my footnote says, or confuse the word Belal, B-A-L-A-L, which is Hebrew, which means to confuse. Others will say that this was the origin of Babylon, which it seems like that's right. I'm not, you know, all about geography in that way, but that does seem right. Because the Lord confused the language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth. Just in case you didn't get it in verse 8, they were scattered everywhere. So that is the entire story of Babel, when God scatters mankind. Some people believe that that is the beginning of course, customs and that kind of thing. Did you have something else, Tori?
It doesn't say that they were trying to see God. I don't know why I have in my mind from just recollection that they were trying to reach, like see God.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's a misconception I had.
Well, you probably heard a sermon or 2 or 10 about it, and because it's one of those things where people are attempting to understand, um, you could possibly read that into it when they say, "Let us make ourselves a name," and they're trying to preserve their own culture right there. So I know I've heard sermons like that, and when I read this, a few years back, and I was like, well, there's not really anything there that says we want to be like God and we want to, it was about pride, and so God struck them down. We're not told, but we are told it wasn't the right time. And if it was wrong for them to build a tower and to build a city and to reach high up into the sky, then it's wrong for, everywhere that's been done. It to me, I mean, that's where I land. It just wasn't the right time.
Thank you.
Okay, so that takes us to verse 9 of Genesis chapter 11. And then we go into another genealogy. And again, these are very important. We're not going to spend a lot of time reading them. But in this genealogy, we are introduced to Abraham. Just a minute, Nancy's trying to log on again. Make sure she doesn't miss anything. Hey, Nancy, sorry about that. So we did just wrap up the Tower of Babel through verse 9. And we're moving on in Genesis 11, verses 10 through 32. And in this genealogy, we're introduced to Abram, and that's very significant because if you know anything from the New Testament, the Jews, when they reference the Old Testament, a lot of times they'll say, but Abraham was our father. Abraham was our father. We claim Abraham. And so this is the beginning of the history of his family. So let's see. Starting in verse 26, Terah, which is Abraham's father, lived 70 years and became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And of course, many of you already know Abram later becomes Abraham, and I will mistakenly use them interchangeably at all times, and I'm sorry about that. But verse 27, now these are the records of the generations of Terah, and it goes on to talk about that. Verse 29, Abram and Nahor, Abram's brother, took wives for themselves. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Verse 30, very significant, Sarai was barren. She had no child. It was very obvious right away, once a woman got married, whether or not she was barren or not, because birth control wasn't a thing. People didn't make choices about that. And if she was able to get pregnant, she would get pregnant. So they knew pretty quickly. Verse 31, at the end of Genesis 11, Terah took Abram his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son, Abram's wife, and they went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans in order to enter the land of Canaan, and they went as far as Haran and settled there. So interestingly here, Terah, Abraham's father, was taking the family and moving them, but they didn't get where they needed to go, and they landed in Haran. I suppose that's the way you say that word, Haran, and they stopped and they settled there. 32, the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Now, Genesis 12 is where really the story of the Israelites begins. We have these things before it. Remember, the creation, the fall, Cain and Abel, the flood, and the Tower of Babel. We have all those things before Abraham. And by the way, many people believe that the story of Job was also somewhere before the story of Abraham. They just know it was a very old time. But now in Genesis 12 is where the story of Abraham actually begins. So I want to read that. Kim, how do you feel about reading a little more? Is she on?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay. I would like you to read verses 1 through 9, please.
Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on, still going toward the Negeb.
Thank you. So Abraham the Lord talks to Abraham, and he tells him to leave. Abraham is 75 years old. That's in verse 4 of chapter 12. He's 75 years old, and he is told to leave his father. Leave your relatives, leave your father's house. He was not told that he could or couldn't take Lot, his nephew, but he does end up taking Lot. So he doesn't leave all of the relatives there. And he says in verse 2, I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. So already that's a bit of a eyebrow raiser, because his wife is barren. His wife can't have children. Now that's not really discussed in this chapter, but it's just sort of put out there in the chapter before in verse 30. She was barren, and God is going to make him a great nation in chapter 12. But I think for the purpose of tonight's study, because we're going to go through chapter 12, I would like you to look at verse 3. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So it's a conversation that involves protection of Abraham. I'm gonna bless those who bless you, and I will curse the ones that curse you. It says it, and the one who curses you I will curse. And then what we have in verse 4 is obedience of Abraham. So Abraham went forth as the Lord had spoken to him. Lot went with him, and this is where it says he was 75 years old. So he is actually leaving, and he is going to continue the journey that his father had begun. We don't know why his father had begun that journey, but of course he never quite made it there. And Abraham begins the journey and goes to the land of Canaan. Let me see. And as soon as he, it says in verse 8 that he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. Now there's something I want you to know. We're told in Joshua chapter 24, I'm not exactly sure what, I think it's right in the beginning of Joshua 24, that Abraham and his family were not worshipers of God. In fact, I want to turn there because it seems so alarming that that would be the case. Because what we're reading here in Genesis, it's clear that Abraham is a worshiper of God. He's building an altar to God. He's listening to him. He's obeying him. So Joshua chapter 24, this is Joshua's farewell address to Israel. And then in 24, it says he reviews Israel's history. Chapter 24, verses 1 and 2. Then Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem and called for the elders of Israel and for their heads and their judges and their officers, and they presented themselves before God. Joshua said to all the people, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, from ancient times your fathers lived beyond the river, namely Terah, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods." Verse 3, "Then I took your father Abraham from beyond the river and led him through all the land of Canaan and multiplied his descendants and gave him Isaac." And then it goes on to talk about more history of the Israelites. But what's significant there was Abraham was plucked out of this family unit because people lived in, what we would consider like a homestead where you had the whole family there. And if there's more people adding on to the family, then they get some land just down the homestead. But he plucked him out of this area and he put him on a journey. And at that moment, Abraham started following the Lord. And they call him the Lord throughout the story. And that's pretty significant because we just always think that God, who was in the beginning, not really introducing himself, but just declaring that he created the heavens. And then he had these conversations that we've noted all the way up until now, all the way up until Genesis 12. We just assumed that that was everybody's understanding, that they knew who God was, but they've gotten far away from it. I think there were 7 generations between Noah and Abraham. That's a lot of time, especially when, for instance, Abraham's father was 205 years old when he died. So those generations are longer and longer. So it's a lot of time. And these people have gotten, as we do, people have gotten farther and farther away from God. So I don't know about you, but I found that extremely interesting. Had you heard that before? That Abraham was an idol worshiper before he was a worshiper of God. It's in Joshua 24 and verse 2. Okay, so we'll move on from there. Kim, can you read for me Genesis 12, 10 through 16?
Okay. 10 through 16.
Mhm.
Now there was a famine in the land, so Abraham went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai his wife, "I know that you are a woman beautiful in appearance, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' Then they will kill me, and they will let you live. Say you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake." When Abraham entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. And when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake, he dealt well with Abram, and he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, and camels. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarah, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say, 'She is my sister,' so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go." And Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had.
Thank you. So it doesn't take very long. We're not told exactly how long, but it doesn't take very long for Abraham to exile himself out of the land of Canaan. Remember, we talked the very first class. We talked about one of the vocabulary words in the Old Testament that's significant is exile. And that was any time that God's people were not where they were supposed to be, which was in the land of Canaan, the promised land. If you look back up in chapter 12 and verse 1, Abraham is being told to leave the land you are in, and you are to go to a land which I will show you. So this begins the idea of that land promise. And Abraham, because of the famine, has left in verse 10. So Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. Now there's a distinct difference between, for instance, Genesis 11, verse 31, the very last 3 words of that are, and settled there, right? Abraham's family had settled in Haran or Haran. And what we just read in Genesis 12 and verse 10, where Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there. There's a distinction. He wasn't planning to stay in Egypt. He was going to be there for a time, but he is still out of his land, and he does get into trouble there. So when he's coming near to Egypt, he said to his wife, who was already pretty old at this time, but still a stunner, he said, I know that you're beautiful women, and they're going to see you, and they're going to say this is his wife, but we want her, so they're going to kill me for you. But you're going to be fine. You're going to be fine. They're going to let you live. So this is what I need you to do for me. Say that you're my sister, so they won't kill me, and that I may go well with me. So what he feared was going to happen was exactly what happened. Verse 14, the Egyptians saw that this woman was beautiful. They praised her to Pharaoh. I guess they found a beautiful woman for him. And she was taken into Pharaoh's house. And he wasn't, as far as he knew, doing anything wrong. In fact, he gave Abraham a lot of great things, a lot of gifts. It might have been like a dowry, if you know what that is. It might have been like payment for Sarah, which I'm sure rubs all of you as wrong as it rubs me. But in any case, he wasn't trying to steal someone away from Abram. And so she's in his house. He treated Abram well in verse 16. And then 17, stuff starts to happen. And his home is struck with great plagues because of Abram's wife. So these are the first Egyptian plagues, I guess. We're not told what those plagues are, but Pharaoh takes the hint, like he gets it, right? Later, we'll actually be told of a conversation between God and, I believe, the Pharaoh. I don't think it's the same Pharaoh, but here we're not told about a conversation. But somehow he puts 2 and 2 together and understands that this was the wrong thing to do, right? Then Pharaoh called Abram in verse 18 and said, what is this you've done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? So here's an interesting, probably a thread we'll follow throughout the Old Testament, and that is the whole thread of marriage and who is married to who. It is so interesting that in so many cultures, marriage is sacred, right? Because if marriage was not sacred to Pharaoh, who cares that it was Abram's wife? Who cares? You had her, I'm going to have her. We'll just all, just not have any bounds or any covenants or any promises between us. But it's clear that it mattered. It mattered to Abram and it mattered to Pharaoh. It kind of seems like it didn't matter quite as much to Abram since he was willing to lie about it and he knew they were going to take her. I mean, that's horrific in its own, that's some little trail we could go down another time. But it mattered to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said, why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Implying that he wouldn't have done this had he known. and he probably would have killed Abram. I mean, Abraham was probably right about that. Verse 19, why did you say she's my sister so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go. I need these plagues gone from my home. I was not trying to do something that was wrong and take your wife. And so you need to go. And then 20, Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, meaning Abram, and they escorted him, Abram, away with his wife and all that belonged to him. So we're not really talking anymore about the famine. By this time, the famine must be over, but Abram is escorted out, and this whole thing is going to be put behind them. What's interesting about this, which I know you've probably heard so many lessons about this, but Abram is a liar. Abram is a manipulator of circumstances in order to get an outcome that he wants. It's very immoral. We're only told about that right now. Up to this point, we're only told about this instance. But apparently this was an easy lifestyle for him, which is pretty serious. It lacks integrity, and it lacks faith, of course. I mean, a lot of us are guilty of lacking faith, but lying so that things will come out the way you want them to is very, very serious. It's a character flaw as far as I'm concerned. I think it's a serious business. Later, we're going to talk about the people that are back home, where Abram left, people like Laban, people like Rebecca, and they were all a little dishonest. They were all like shysters, if you will. They were shifty, and they lied a lot of times to get an outcome that they wanted. So right now, Abram seems like he's one of them. It seems like he's still kind of doing what he learned at home. So anybody have any comments about Genesis 12? We kind of went on it at a fast pace. It's a great story, but there's not really a lot more there. Anybody? Abraham, one of our great heroes of faith. The first thing we hear about is him lying about his wife to save his own hiney. And you know what? God just told him, I'm going to protect you. He just told him that. So, he's just not all in on this yet, I guess. Okay, well, let's move on to chapter 13 then. So we have, and we're probably going to go pretty high level once we hit chapter 14, but I want to get a little bit into Abraham and Lot, because if you're talking about culturally and what's in our culture and where did it come from, there are stories about Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot's wife that are all within our culture. You can look up any of those phrases on Google, and you will find all kinds of things that have come off of that, spawned off of that, if you will. So we're in chapter 13. Abraham goes from Egypt. In fact, Kim, can I get you to read for me again?
Sure.
All right, I'd like you to read through verse 7 of Genesis 13.
So Abraham went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him into the Negev. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold, and he journeyed on from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. And Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. At that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land.
Okay, so Abram begins journeying back to Egypt, back from Egypt, and he stops where he had stopped before, and where he had built the altar to the Lord before in verse 8 of chapter 12. Maybe renewing his commitment. Maybe, we're not told what that was about. But it does say that he called on the name of the Lord. So sometimes that's a phrase to say, he was invoking a blessing. We don't know. But we realize that Abram and Lot are having trouble because God has blessed them so much. And they're having, their possessions were so great, it says in verse 6, that they were not able to remain together. Sometimes when things get so big, it's just a lot to manage, and they couldn't do it together. Plus, there was trouble between their herdsmen. And so, Kim, go ahead and read 8 through 13 for us.
Then Abram said to Lot, let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right. And if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left. And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other. Is that where you wanted me to stop?
Stop. Read 12 and 13 now.
Okay. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord.
Thank you. So you get a little sense of how Genesis is an editorial book, meaning it was written by Moses, but Moses wasn't here at the time. So here we get a little bit of that I have other information than what's in the story kind of thing, because it says, especially in verse 10, that this land where Lot lifted his eyes and looked on this land, remember this whole area is called the Fertile Crescent. It's just incredibly fertile and beautiful. It describes it like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go to Zoar. But it says I have little M dashes that it says, this was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So it's like they're telling you the end of the story, right? But it's explaining that after that happened, it was not beautiful. It was desolate and just devastated. But here is where you get a tiny bit of that sense that this is a story that's being told well after it happened. That's probably obvious to you, but not everybody understands that. So Abram gives Lot a choice. There shouldn't be any trouble, and we've got this whole area. You just need to choose where you're going to go. And wherever you choose, I'll choose the other way. Lot chose all of this beautiful land, and I've heard lessons where he's very demonized for choosing that land. We're not told that he knew that the men of Sodom were wicked exceedingly and sinners against the Lord, like it says in verse 13. We're not told that Lot knew that. Now, if Lot did know that, this was a terrible choice. But what we do know about Lot is that he is the head of a family, his little family, that has lots and lots of cattle and lots of herdsmen. And moving to a land that your herds are going to thrive off of would have been smart. It wouldn't have been an evil choice. It would have been a good choice. But we know that the men were evil. So verse 14 through 18, Kim, can you finish it out for us?
Sure. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from us, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land that you see, I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord.
Okay, so we got a hint of this land promise, to the land which I will show you, in Genesis 12 and verse 1. And now we're getting a fuller picture of the land that he's promised. For all the land which you see, verse 15, I will give to you and your descendants forever. This isn't going to be the only time that God mentions this, but this is significant because it's very descriptive, right? And he says, lift up your eyes and look, just everything as far as the eye can see. Of course, he could have used the Tower of Babel at that point. It would have come in handy. Could have seen further. I'm kidding. And then verse 16, I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth. So now this is the seed promise. We had the land promise. This is what's called the seed promise, which is funny because his wife is unable to have children. But you're going to have descendants, and they will be like the dust of the earth, which is an awesome description. It would be even as descriptive as saying the sand of the sea, right? Or, maybe we'll see later the stars in the sky, right? It's just not going to be countable. It's going to be so prolific that they're going to be everywhere. Then your descendants can also be numbered. Arise, walk about the land through its length and breadth, for I will give it to you. So familiarize yourself with this land. This is the land I'm giving to you. Then Abram moved his tent. He believed God and came and dwelt by the oaks of the Mamre, which are in Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. Building an altar was not a haphazard thing. You didn't move them around like you moved a tent around. Remember, he had built an altar back by Ai, and then when he went back that way, he sacrificed on that altar again. It was still there. It was up. I would love to know what they look like. And now he's built an altar to the Lord here. And that's as far as I'll go there. I'm probably going to really gloss over 14. We're gonna look at chapter 14 and verse 17 and on a little bit, just about God's promise to Abram, because we're gonna just keep that thread throughout the Old Testament, just that thread of promise and God's promise to Abram. Anybody have any comments on Genesis, I guess 11, 12, and 13? No comments. Just me and my voice. The soft, soothing sound of my voice. My voice really does put people to sleep. It's just the way it is. Okay, so I've got to run. I'm working on retreat food, so I've got my house full of other people's food right now. But it was awesome seeing everybody.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thanks, Jen. I like hearing your voice.
Puts you to sleep.